Just a week on from Starship Flight 9, SpaceX are already gearing up for Flight 10 with Booster 16 static fire. Plus, 2 new launch pads are coming as a huge update dropped on the Space Coast, providing insight into the massive scale that SpaceX is planning in Florida. We've got all of this and much more coming up in this Starbase update, sponsored by Novium. I assure you there's not that much infrastructure to discuss in this episode, but this particular point is rather significant. Now that the high bay is completely gone, we anticipated that SpaceX would move fairly quickly to get the Giga Bay operational, and we're seeing increasing signs that assumption was correct. On Monday, a pile driver arrived at the production site. These are used to drive piles, the foundation pillars, into the ground, preparing the soil for a substantial building to rest upon. This is particularly challenging in the marshy area that is Boca Chica. Of course, this could be for another structure, but given we know the Giga Bay is due to be built, I take this as a promising indication that construction is set to begin very soon. Over at Massey's, testing for the next generation of Super Heavy boosters is well underway. On Monday, we observed a fully frosty booster 18.1, likely undergoing structural testing. The ice visible is probably due to liquid nitrogen being inside, which is used for cryogenic testing of these test articles. It's unclear whether the pistons around the test article were active during the test, or if this was merely a cryogenic test to determine the performance parameters in cold conditions. It's always tricky with these test tanks because we have to view from a distance. One possibility later on in the test campaign is a test to destruction, but if that is planned, it might not take place within the structural test stand to avoid damaging it. But if SpaceX truly wants to determine the absolute pressure and design limits of the next generation booster, they might need to push this test article to its limit. We've seen that once or twice before. On Tuesday, the testing continued and we observed the tank becoming frosty again as SpaceX conducted a second round. This second round, however, appeared somewhat different from the first, as the tank remained largely empty during most of the testing, with only the bottom section getting frosty. So either the cryogenic load was very low, or this was a test of the header tank located at the bottom of the test tank. And yes, that's Ship 37 in the background departing the Massey's test site. It appears the testing campaign for the ship has wrapped up, and it's now time to complete the still rather rough looking heat shield if it's truly required in 6 to 8 weeks' time. Naturally, we've seen SpaceX work on these heat shields rather quickly before, but of all the vehicles sent to Massey's for cryogenic testing, Ship 37 certainly appears to be in the roughest state. It'll be interesting to see how swiftly SpaceX can cover all of these underlaying blankets with the actual shield that needs to be fitted on top. Ship 37 has since returned to Giga Bay 2, where it will now be prepared for its static fire campaign, likely in about a month's time. Whilst we're on the subject of future ships and boosters, let's discuss this. A 4-ring or so-called quad barrel section has rolled into Giga Bay 1. This is most likely for Booster 18, the first Block 3 booster, currently being stacked inside that bay. As it's such a significant component, this provides a wonderful opportunity to review its current progress. With this section, Booster 18 now comprises 19 rings. The final lower section is expected to have 25 rings in total, so it will gain another quad barrel and likely a shorter dual barrel to form the very end of the booster. This would then complete its liquid oxygen tank. On the methane side, we anticipate 2 more quad barrels and another triple barrel with the integrated hot staging ring on top. Thus, the next steps for this booster will be 2 more stacks to complete the LOX side, 2 more stacks for the methane side, and then 1 final assembly stack to fully complete Booster 18. They're progressing swiftly with this one and are, at this point, over halfway done. This also means one of the next components we'll likely see is the thrust section at the bottom of the booster, which of course features significant changes to components such as the heat shielding with the transition to Raptor 3. Therefore, this is one of the most exciting parts we'll see during stacking. Perhaps next week? The most concerning aspect at this stage for the readiness of Block 3 is, as we've all come to expect at this point, the ship. While Star Factory likely already houses components for that ship, stacking hasn't yet been completed. However, now that Ship 38 is fully stacked as well, this could happen any day now. Over at the new orbital launch pad, we're observing an increasing number of tests that certainly resemble catch simulations with the chopsticks. Naturally, a ship catch isn't anticipated for the next flight, Flight 10, given the ongoing issues with the upper stage. However, Flight 11 or Flight 12 could be potential targets based on Elon Musk's estimate requirement of a catch as early as 2 to 3 months from now, and for that, according to the renders shown by SpaceX, they would use the second tower to catch the ship. That's the reason for the testing. Speaking of Pad B, or well, the second pad, SpaceX Communications' Dan Huot dropped a bomb on X the other day, saying, quote, "I try to never weigh in on stuff like this, way too many emotions tied up into being right and the other person being wrong, but I'm worried about what it means for the future generations if they grow up believing something that just isn't true. So here we go. It's Pad 2. It's not Pad B. It's always been Pad 2, and I'm sorry if this hurts." So after the FAA paperwork initially referred to it as Pad B, and how everyone else has been referring to it as Pad B for well over a year now, it appears SpaceX has internally renamed it with a much worse name in my opinion, Pad 2. Still could be worse considering we've seen Pad West on delivery labels before. Heck, Dan never said anything about the original launch pad, so for all we know it could be Pad A and Pad 2. Good old SpaceX keeping up their reputation of maximum naming inconsistency. One major task over the past few days has been the installation of the enormous booster quick disconnect cover on Pad Beyer. This component was still supported by a crane, and on Tuesday we observed welding for several hours, suggesting the part is being fixed to the orbital launch mount area. Two of these will house the intricate plumbing needed to fuel the Block 3 boosters on the pad, whilst of course the ships will be fueled using a ship quick disconnect arm, which Pad Beta currently lacks. Before we delve into the brand new information about the two Starship pads being built at Cape Canaveral Slick 37, it's time for our McGregor Minute. At the SpaceX engine testing facility, things got rather lively this week. On Monday, a Raptor 3 engine underwent a brief firing, followed by a relight test. You can observe the engine shutting down, and then, mere seconds later, from the same spot, the plume reappears. And on Thursday, it appears a Raptor engine got a tad excited, as near the end of its lengthy burn, you can clearly see an explosion occurring. Whilst the last time a Raptor exploded, it seemed more like it happened on the test stand, this time it appears the engine experienced a rather abrupt halt. But again, it's testing. These things do happen, and sometimes are intended to happen. In total, 20 Raptor engine tests were carried out last week, with a blend of Raptor 2 and Raptor 3 engines being tested. As always, if you fancy hearing the roar of Raptor engines more frequently than just the occasional static fires in Boca Chica, we strongly recommend McGregor Live 24/7.
This video is sponsored by Novium. They make really cool magnetically hovering pens, which is excellent because Father's Day is coming up, and they make the perfect dad gift. I love that Novium's been sponsoring us for a while now because hover pens are inspired by space and give any desk you put them on a little touch of the coolness of weightlessness. Plus, when you give one as a gift, not only will the recipient be reminded of the coolness of weightlessness and space, but also of you. Dads everywhere work their butts off, often for little or no thanks. So give your pop-pop something cool this Father's Day, and not something lame like a tie or another pair of socks. There's a bunch of different cool designs to choose from, including the Interstellar Edition, which features a tilt of 23.5 degrees, same as the Earth's axis of rotation. Comes in a bunch of cool colors, the best of which is Mars Magma, don't at me. Plus there are premium editions made with 18 karat gold, and they even have a real meteorite embedded in them. There's also my favorite, the Future Edition, which features an interchangeable tip so you can switch back and forth between fountain tip and rollerball as desired. Do you have a cool art dad who does calligraphy or something? Well, this is the perfect hover pen for them. Of course, since the pens hover, they're also an amazing thing to have on your desk to just idly mess with. I mean, just look at that bad boy spin. I can see your dad now, idly spinning his hover pen as he contemplates the latest thing you texted him that he has no chance of understanding. Use code NSF to receive 15% off all hover pens for the next 48 hours. It'll be 10% off after that. Plus, you'll get free shipping to most countries. Thanks again to Novium for sponsoring this video and for making a cool product.
This week, we received rather significant news regarding a Space Coast launch site for Starship. To be precise, we obtained the Starship Super Heavy Environmental Impact Statement for Space Launch Complex 37. This launch area, originally built in 1959 to support the Saturn I and the Saturn 1B, has been of interest to SpaceX for quite some time following the retirement of the Delta IV and Delta IV Heavy. And we've got some highly detailed plans in this environmental statement outlining what SpaceX intends to do in this area. The initial question though is why? They already have Launch Complex 39A, don't they? So why do they need additional launch capabilities on the Space Coast? Not only do they have an extraordinarily ambitious plan to ramp up operations in Florida, but there's another reason: defense payloads. According to the environmental statement, the reason SpaceX is pursuing this area is, quote, to advance US space space capabilities by providing launch and landing infrastructure in furtherance of US policy to ensure capabilities to launch and insert national security payloads into space. Thus, it appears the primary purpose of this pad would be to establish a Starship presence at the Cape Canaveral Space Force Station to launch high-level security payloads on Starship. Examining this map further into the document, we can discern the rationale behind their approach. The other launch complexes of the Starship program proposed to date are within the boundaries of the Kennedy Space Center, whereas Space Launch Complex 37 is part of the Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. Thus, this would enable self-contained operations within the Space Force base, without any need to leave the base and travel to the KSC. On page 8, we are then presented with what SpaceX has planned. The proposed action is to fully redevelop Slick 37 to meet Starship's requirements and to carry out various road improvements and widenings in the Space Force Station and KSC areas to facilitate the transport of the vehicles. This includes widening Phillips Parkway, expanding the old A1A, and more. All of this is to support the transport of the massive 9-meter wide and significantly taller vehicles around the Cape from Roberts Road and other areas. So just how often is SpaceX planning to launch from this brand new pad? Brace yourself for this one. They are planning to launch 76 times per year. 76, which combined with the 40 proposed from LC-39A brings the total planned Starship launches from the Cape to over 100 per year. Indeed, they're also requesting 76 Super Heavy landings and 76 Starship landings, with up to 20% of annual launches potentially being scrubbed. Curiously, they're even considering very long and large-scale missions, as they note that the Super Heavy lands minutes after launch, but a Starship might land between hours and years after mission launch. Quite the remarkable planning scope. In the overall summary of activities, they're estimating a maximum of 396 annual activities at the pad area. This includes static fires for both vehicles, 76 each, up to 16 scrubs, 76 landings for each vehicle, and naturally 76 launches. So I hope you enjoy NSF streams, because if these plans come to fruition, Space Coast Live might be just a little bit busier. Overall, SpaceX is proposing not one, but 2 launch pads at the Slick 37 complex. Both comprise launch pads, launch mounts, integration towers, launch diverter or trench structures, landing pads, and landing catch towers or test stands. The latter suggests, and we'll get more details on this later, that this complex combines the functions of Massey's and the orbital launch site. They intend to test ships and boosters on these pads as well, which will necessitate a rather intriguing OLM design to accommodate ships. Let's analyse these plans in greater detail. We have a schematic showing where everything within the pad perimeter will be positioned and what kind of areas SpaceX has planned. Naturally, this will also include more general elements such as stormwater retention ponds, which we see practically everywhere at the Kennedy Space Center and the Space Force Station. However, most of the mentioned structures are rather interesting. Let's begin at the southern end of the pad. There we have the ground support building and equipment. This will most likely be used for swift Starship repairs, general maintenance, and serve as the primary building at the site, capable of supporting launch preparation operations. Next, of course, we have the tank farm. Indeed, much like Starbase, it appears there will be one enormous tank farm supporting both pads. At the northwestern part of the pad, areas are designated for liquid methane, liquid nitrogen, and liquid oxygen storage. Additionally, this area includes liquefiers and a natural gas area. According to the document, this area will be used to filter impurities such as mercury, sulfur, water, and carbon dioxide from the methane, upgrading the methane from pipeline quality to a much higher grade substance. The surplus gas would also be utilised for power generation within the system. The document also details the methane liquefier. This would be used to supercool natural gas into a liquid state for storage and transportation, aiding in the management of the vast tank farm. There's one final tank farm related item you might recall from early BocaChica tests, an air separation unit, or ASU. This proposed unit would enable on-site generation of nitrogen and oxygen rather than transporting it to the pad. This mirrors plans at Starbase, although, apart from experimentation with a single ASU we saw some time ago, it seems SpaceX has not yet fully implemented this project. Let's turn to the launch pads. It appears both pads will each have their own deluge system, much like Starbase. This is marked as water storage tanks. Additionally, both pads feature a launch integration tower and a mount, which appears to be designed similarly to the flame trench in Starbase. One pad will be located in the northern part, while the other will be in the southern part of the complex. both seem to be oriented in the same direction, allowing for an unobstructed return to the chopsticks from the open Atlantic Ocean without a tower obstructing the path. On the following page, we're provided with further details about the vehicles planned for this complex. By the way, please disregard these renders in the document. It appears the overall designs are quite outdated, though the information itself is not. The proposed vehicle for this launch pad is 150 meters tall, matching the 150-meter vehicle we've seen in similar paperwork for the Cape and Starbase previously. So this seems to be the upper limit of SpaceX's vision for this vehicle, at least for now. The same applies to the thrust, which has an upper limit of 103 meganewtons. The upper stage is up to 28 meganewtons and features up to 9 engines as anticipated for future vehicles. What's particularly intriguing about this information page is the time frame for getting this all operational. Quote, the first Starship Super Heavy launch from Slick 37 would be planned to occur in 2026. Up to 450 additional full-time employees or contractors would be needed to support launch activities 24 hours per day, 7 days per week throughout the year. Thus, this launch pad is intended to be operational by the end of next year in 19 months' time. We can expect a tremendous surge in construction activity in this area, and we may have already noticed early signs of it. Recall that our team member Anthony recently flew over the Cape and observed indications that they might soon construct another Starship tower. This could be the first of 2 launch towers at Slick 37. By the way, these towers will be considerably larger than those in Starbase. The anticipated height is 182 meters, approximately 20% taller than the towers in Starbase, which are under 152 meters. The primary focus of the next few pages is information on the operations of this program and how SpaceX intends to manage vehicle transport and landings at Slick 37. First, something we've heard for quite some time now, and here it is again, Starship Super Heavy and components would arrive from SpaceX's Starbase in Texas. The components would be transported horizontally via a barge from the port of Brownsville, Texas to CCSFS, Port Canaveral, Hangar AF Wharf or KSC wharfs, and then delivered to the launch site via over-the-road transport. Indeed, it appears the initial ships and boosters here would not originate from the planned Roberts Road Star Factory and Giga Bay, but would be exclusively constructed at Starbase and then loaded onto a barge and transported horizontally to the Cape. So in the future, we'll see 80-meter long vehicles, 9 meters wide, lying on a massive barge, transporting them across the Gulf to Florida, which is going to be quite a sight. The details of launch and static fire tests are not particularly riveting. However, the landing scenarios are noteworthy. According to the document, there are 3 ways a Super Heavy mission could conclude. First, a return to launch site operation where it would be caught by the integration tower, as we've seen multiple times now. Alternatively, it could land on a floating platform stationed no closer than 9.26 kilometers off the coast. So the sea platform plan isn't entirely abandoned either. Both scenarios would release up to 26 metric tons of methane and oxygen into the atmosphere, as SpaceX would vent the remaining propellant rather than capture it. The third scenario is, of course, a Super Heavy expendable scenario, in which the booster would end up in a predetermined splashdown zone. Once again, there's no surprises there. On a subsequent page, we can see these landing zones are more clearly defined. The yellow bar here indicates the potential Super Heavy landing area, which naturally could be quite adaptable depending on the targeted orbit and mission profile. As for the ship, it appears the re-entry corridor will pass over Tampa and just south of Orlando before landing at Slick 37. This closely resembles the Space Shuttle re-entry corridor used for the Kennedy Space Center landings. Regarding the splashdown zones for expendable scenarios, we're seeing several areas around the Gulf and near the Cape, as well as designated areas in the Indian Ocean and numerous potential landing zones in the Pacific for what are, hopefully, very rare expendable mission profiles. This entire report, of course, is merely the released draft for the Environmental Impact Statement, or EIS. Nothing has been approved just yet. There will be a comment period and further amendments before it is fully approved and implemented. On the project's website, we can see that the release of this public draft EIS was scheduled for spring, which I suppose it nearly managed. For the summer, public comment meetings are planned and the draft EIS will be adjusted accordingly before the final EIS is published in autumn 2025. This would then clear SpaceX for construction. Currently, the FAA and SpaceX have 3 in-person meetings scheduled for July, and another virtual meeting later in July, so brace yourself for some lively comments from those who support or oppose the idea of over 100 Starship launches annually from the Space Coast. The good news is, we have our cameras ready to capture all of this progress, so keep an eye on Space Coast Live 24/7. Moving back to Starbase, over at the launch site, Pad A's booster quick disconnect remains open, following what appears to be damage sustained during the launch of Flight 9. The good news is that the work observed so far seems to be confined to the cover of the booster quick disconnect and not the more sensitive hardware itself inside, so one could argue the cover served its purpose. An important point to note is that the cover not closing wouldn't hinder any testing or static fire attempts. After all, the booster quick disconnect really should be a booster don't disconnect for ground-based testing. Thus, providing SpaceX repairs the cover before Flight 10, this is not a critical issue for anything else to our knowledge. Do you want evidence for that theory? On Tuesday, a booster transport stand was moved into Giga Bay 1. The only plausible explanation we had at the time, given that Booster 18 is certainly not ready for cryogenic testing, was to collect Booster 16 for its static fire test campaign. In the early hours, the booster was transported to the launch site. From this point, the process is surely familiar. Due to the Giga Bay construction, the booster had to take the long way round, travelling through the Sanchez site. From there, it proceeded onto Highway 4, where the vehicle was moved along with its 33 Raptor engines already fitted. It's worth noting, as we now must, that this marks the inaugural flight campaign for Booster 16. Flight 10 will be its maiden flight. Presently, according to information from SpaceX's Shana Diaz on X, we anticipate this will involve a catch attempt rather than another splashdown. Following its arrival in the early morning hours, SpaceX performed a lift, and just a week after the last flight, we once again have a super heavy booster on Launch Pad A. Or 1. Whatever you want to call it, we shouldn't let pedantics overshadow the fact of what a remarkably good turnaround this is by SpaceX. Preparing a pad to be test ready again after a launch just a week earlier is something most launch providers would spend weeks on, yet SpaceX has done it in a few days with the largest rocket ever built. And even on the booster quick disconnect side of things, it appears SpaceX has managed to act remarkably quickly. The hood was able to open and close again and successfully connected to the booster. Around this time, we also received notice of a road closure for testing. Booster 16 was scheduled to be tested on Thursday or Friday between 7 in the morning and 7 in the evening local time, with Thursday as the primary date and Friday as the backup, should SpaceX not complete all testing objectives on Thursday. And yes, this is indeed foreshadowing. One feature this booster is still lacking, of course, is the hot staging ring. This is quite typical for static fire campaigns, indicating that after the campaign, they will transport the booster back to the production site, inspect it, and fit its crown. This is still a Block 2 booster, so the interstage is a modular design and not fully installed during the stacking process. As previously discussed, that will change with Booster 18. On Thursday, SpaceX closed Highway 4, and we observed the tank farm activating to supply Pad A with the necessary commodities for a booster static fire. Both tanks became frosty as expected. A large quantity of liquid oxygen was in the lower tank with a smaller amount of methane in the upper tank. But then, well, nothing happened. The booster appeared to be just minutes away from a static fire, but it remained idle for an extended period before the cryogenics were removed and the test was concluded for the day. Based on previous test procedures, it's highly likely that this was indeed a static fire attempt, suggesting SpaceX encountered minor issues and opted to play it safe by standing down. Now, I'm already anticipating some comments suggesting this was likely a tanking test, and yes, that is a possibility. However, the propellant quantity didn't mimic a full propellant load, which would be more typical for a tanking test, and instead matched the usual amount for a static fire test. Moreover, they used methane, which they typically only do when absolutely necessary, which is why we're confident this was an aborted static fire test. But fear not, just a day later we witnessed some beautiful static fire action, as SpaceX successfully conducted an engine test with Booster 16's 33 Raptor engines. The booster was then removed from the orbital launch mount in the early hours of Saturday, placed on its transport stand and transported back to the production site, where it will be prepared for launch, possibly in just a few weeks' time. In a statement on X, the company said, quote, "Full duration static fire of all 33 Raptor engines on the Super Heavy booster ahead of Starship's next flight test. Full duration in this instance refers to the complete planned testing duration, which was approximately 10 seconds. So now all attention is on Ship 36, which remains tucked away in Giga Bay 2. But once it rolls out, a flight could be just days away. So what do you reckon? A flight in June? I believe it's still possible at this stage, but it all depends on what SpaceX has in store. Thanks to Novium for sponsoring this video. Don't forget to use code NSF for 15% off their hover pens for the next 48 hours, and it'll be 10% off afterwards. For now though, I've been Caton for NSF, thanks for watching, and goodbye.